All right. Good evening and welcome to this edition of the Australian Calabrese Cultural Association program Sono Calabrese, a program in which we have conversations with members of our communities about issues of interest to the community. I'm Vince Marfuni, and tonight's guests are Katrina and Gracie Lolicato. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for taking time to participate.
Thank you.
Yeah. Katrina and Gracie are twin sisters, am I right?
Yes.
And indeed, third generation Italo-Australians. And amongst other things, you're oral historians. You've established the Foundling Archive. You've written on matters of interest to the Italian community. You've produced a booklet, Knobs and Sobs, is it? Which is the difference between living north or south of Bell Street.
Bell Street, that's it.
Yeah. And very significantly, during last year, in the period of COVID, you initiated the program Mano in Mano, which was a program designed to give assistance to Italian students who were trapped in Australia because of the virus. And I understand that in respect of it, you were the recipients of an award from the state government.
Yes.
And as a sideline, you're both studying. You're both doing PhD, or?
So I'm completing my PhD. Gracie's just completed her honours degree.
Yeah, and I'm looking to do a PhD this year, but I've been slowed down by a couple of little. I've had a set of twins myself during COVID. So they've slowed me down a little.
And I was going to say that on top of all that, you're all also mothers and raising young children.
Absolutely.
So you're not very busy at all, it seems. So I appreciate you taking the time for this interview. Now, as I said, I'll ask the question because I'm sure you're asked all the time. Which one of you is the elder sister?
That'd be Katrina. I am 7 minutes older, I think.
And she's lorded that over me our whole lives, let me tell you.
But it doesn't show at all, Katrina.
Thank you. Very kind of you to say, Vince.
Now, you were born in Australia, I take it. Were your parents also born in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mum was born in Brunswick, and Dad was born in Swan Hill.
Right.
So,
And am I right? On your dad's side, there's Calabrian and Sicilian heritage.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're Bitzers and mixed and minestrones and whatever else you want to call it. Mum's of Lucchese and then Dad's Calabrian and Siciliano.
Right. And in your childhood, did the extended family mix and socialise? A lot of other people that I've interviewed have told me, including Joe Avati.
Yes, absolutely. So Gracie and I are actually the oldest of our cousins on both sides of the family, and as you will know quite well, we are the products of chain migration. So our grandparents brought out their parents and then their brothers and sisters and their cousins. And so we had full villages transplanted here for us to, take advantage of and learn from. And being the oldest, we got quite a bit of attention.
We did. We did. What was great too about our childhood was that all sides of our family really came together. So any kind of special occasion, it wasn't just, we'll go see these rallies and then go see those, whatever. Everyone was always together, which is something that doesn't really happen for our children anymore, I suppose.
Yeah, that is one of the features, whether it's cultural or not, it can be debated. But one of the things it seems to me that the current generation has lost, and I use the term intentionally, is the closeness of the family and the support that gave, albeit that there were also restrictions imposed as a consequence of it. But as you would remember from your childhood, for example, simple things like childminding was not an issue because that's what Nondi were for. And that's gone as a consequence of the modernisation of it. And whether it's a good or a bad thing,
I think things have changed. I think through the generations as well. Our nonne always worked, but our mum still works full time, for instance. But she still kidnaps the children every now and then. I mean, we've got 10 between us. Gracie's done the bulk of the child rearing, but so there are a lot of kids to play with, and I think too that it comes to a point where, we still hang out with our cousins and our kumara, our godparents and that kind of thing. But, once the network gets to a certain point, we can't wander around in mobs of 1,000, So we have to break off eventually and into smaller kind of family groups.
Yeah. And also, I think, obviously, with the broadening of interests, and the pursuit of different interests, I think that naturally leads to distancing with some members of the family, no matter that, how close they formerly were.
Absolutely. We've all got our own homes now, and we've dispersed across Melbourne and Victoria too. I know there's stories of our grandparents living, in houses with 4, 5, 6 other people, or 2 or 3 families at a go. Yeah. So, for better or worse as well, they couldn't really escape them. Yeah. And I suppose, with social, through the generations, you've got social mobility, I suppose, as well. And, that closest that our parents provided for us, yes, there were benefits for it and to us, but I suppose everyone was in the same socioeconomic position. Everyone kind of needed each other to get by. It was a different, there wasn't a lot of other resources other than that social support. So you made the most of that social support. And as we've kind of gone through the generations, we're a little bit more stable now within Australian society. We don't need to maintain those social networks so tightly because, we are better positioned to function, to provide for ourselves. We don't need to, be borrowing from our kumari and kumpari. We don't need to be, it's just different now. Things have changed.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the nature, as I said, the nature of the family has changed. The family used to be an economic unit.
Yeah.
An extended family. It's no longer that.
That's
and
right.
That has consequences to the way we relate. But Katrina, I'm interested in a quote that I read of you, and you said, the best thing about being a woman with my background is that much of the groundwork in overcoming the structural inequalities my family was, and many still are, subjected to have been done for me. I might still be asked, where are you from? But when I respond, there's little animosity or apprehension. Do you recall the quote? Or have I...
Yes, that was luckily enough, that was quite recent. And thank you for having a look. So I was...
I want to ask you, what are the structural inequalities to which you refer there that your family, you say, and others were subjected to?
All of us. Well, God, in many ways, the inequalities that, well, in some ways that the post-war generation encountered economically were in some ways more than other people have now. For instance, going back to our conversation a minute ago, Italians weren't able to apply for the dole or for any government assistance when they arrived in Australia, whereas if you were British, you could. And Australian-born citizens could as well. So again, that had to focus and concentrate on helping each other out. These kinds of things, language, the fact that we now have, the language of the dominant code, that we're able to get educated, and that it's expected of us to become educated and to have jobs beyond manual labor or production line work, that kind of thing as well. So, And there was systemic racism, you know, both from within what we call the Italian community, but also externally as well in Australia. I've read newspaper articles where they're talking about, you know, the olive peril, and they're talking about the Prime Minister catching a wog, you know, in reference to him having a flu or something, you know. This idea of, I've heard stories through our oral histories that we've conducted, you know, of people's windows getting smashed, of being literally driven out of towns, of being put into internment because your market garden is doing better than the Anglos down the road. You know, these things, being the enemy within, you know, and unfortunately we have that now with other groups in Australian society. But for me, that's our privilege, is that we're now, for better or worse, Australian society has decided that they know us and that they're comfortable with the idea of Italians and Italianness. And we can take advantage of that, I think.
That said, though, Katrina, you know, you still feel it, and you still experience other people projecting this idea that maybe you're not as Australian as other people. Like my son, for example, Cole, when he was in year 11, you know, Multicultural Week comes around and Multicultural Day, and my son Cole has blonde hair and blue eyes, and the teacher went around the room, asked everyone where he was from, and he said he was, you know, Calabrese, Abruzzese, Siciliano. And his teacher said, "Oh, Cole, I thought you were normal like the rest of us." Yeah. And you think, what is normal? Is everything other than Anglo-Australian abnormal? And now that was just a couple of years ago, you know, trying to buy a house. And people would say things like, "Oh, you're Italian, you'll appreciate this quote unquote wog palace. You like that stuff. You want this. Sorry, excuse me. You know, you'll need something." Just those stereotypes, those negative connotations still exist. And when you pull someone up and you say, "Oh, hang on a second, what do you mean by that term wog?" And they're like, "Oh, you know, ugly, gaudy, cheap." And you're like, "Well, is that what you think of me? Do you think I'm ugly, I'm gaudy, I'm cheap? Do you think I'm loud, I'm a nuisance?"
You're a good wog.
Pardon? A good one.
Oh, yes, the good one.
You're okay.
Oh, you're okay. We know you. We know you.
And actually, yeah, and actually, growing up as a third generation, we used to get that at school quite a bit, like from the Anglos versus wogs. We're kind of stuck in between. The middle, and the Anglos,
we were the conduit.
would often say, you know, you girls are okay. You're not like them. What does that mean?
But it seems to me there are other structural inequalities or obstacles that are being confronted at the moment also, because Gracie, I know that you did a thesis on a topic, knowledge is power. Isn't that how it goes? Experiences of education and exclusion from within the student equity framework, a young mother's perspective.
That's right.
And from what I read of it, what that disclosed is that there were in fact obstacles for you. I don't know how you define young mother, but I take it to mean someone who's entered the educational system a little later than normal, and there are inbuilt obstacles preventing the fulfilment of whatever dream that individual may have in terms of education. And is that what you've ever done you justice in that? Or?
Yeah, you definitely have. So I define young mother as the government does, as a mother under the age of 24. That's how, you know, young mums are defined these days. And I did interviews with 8 women who did fit into that kind of that category, if you like. Women who were trying to enter into higher education, TAFE and university, and who were really finding it quite difficult for a host of reasons. But I suppose the big lesson I took away, from writing that thesis, was that seemingly fair policies written, especially into education, you know, things like, you know, every child will attend school until year 10. they don't apply. They don't apply to children from low socioeconomic backgrounds, from rural and regional areas, to Indigenous children, to children from CALD backgrounds. Schools and teachers are very willing to overlook policy. So policy written with the best of intentions, they're supposed to protect children, is very easily kind of worked around, and as a consequence, young women, young girls, especially from those backgrounds, from rural regional areas, low socioeconomic backgrounds, and they fall through the cracks, and they end up with less than adequate education outcomes. That said, once they've become mothers and they are motivated to benefit, to kind of improve the lives of their children and themselves, these women work bloody hard to overcome those obstacles. And every single one of the women that I had interviewed years ago have gone into their chosen profession. They might have taken the long way. They might be, approaching 30 now, but they got there. They're nurses and teachers and mechanics. And that study really, it really did change how I looked at policy in general. So what I thought
and indeed, the dichotomy between full-time and part-time studies and students still persists historically. And I did do some teaching in the past life, but I always found that the part-time student was much more committed and was prepared to make whatever sacrifice was required to make sure that he or she got through, whereas the full-time student breezed.
They might not have what these young mums do have, like I said, is motivation, aspirations, ambition, drive. They have the kind of the nous and the willingness to do whatever it takes. And that's the stuff you can't teach. They can learn study skills. They can learn how to write an essay. They're excellent at managing their time, excellent at prioritizing their time. Everything else can be taught. The trick really is getting in the door, getting into the course, working around, the protocol and the procedures just to gain entry. And once they do, statistics, you can see that they are far more engaged students. They tend to do better. The dropout rate might be slightly higher, but those that make it to the end, and I'm talking 3 or 4% higher, but those that make it to the end do much, much better. It's mostly about showing young people that have come from those backgrounds, and young mums from my study, what they don't know. So the big thing that kept coming up, this quote was, we don't know what we don't know. They don't know. They simply don't know how to negotiate things like the entry procedures, and they don't know how to write an essay. But once they get that, they do really well, and like I said, they benefit themselves, their families, and Australian society in general. So,
and in a way, you're a classic example of that, because you had a prior career, didn't you? You were a photographer for 11 years.
I was a photographer. I still am a photographer. I've been a photographer for about 20 years. I did exactly what it is that the women that I interviewed who participated in my study did. I had twins when I was 19. And I dropped out of high school at halfway through year 12, and was home with my babies, and went back to study photography when I was about 21, I think. I was home for the first 2 years. Of course, 20 years ago, childcare wasn't what it is now. And I did rely on my parents, as we were talking about earlier. So mum and my auntie Donna and my cousin Nikki and my nonna Irma looked after the kids for me, so I could go back to school. I studied photography for a couple of years, and then I got a job at the Wangaratta Chronicle, working up there in the northeast as a photojournalist. And I was a single mother at the time, had my 2 little babies, and we had the best time of our lives. We still say, don't tell the other kids that though, but we had a great time. It was
a great place.
Yeah. Well, we did. Like I said, working for a newspaper was in itself an eye-opening experience. And I love the work that we can do. And that's the work of the Foundling Archive now really does merge my background in photography and photojournalism with my the knowledge gained and the skills I've gained in research, studying sociology, as well as Katrina's in cultural heritage and archaeology. And so that's
good.
we found a way to kind of merge all those interests together.
I want to discuss, I think, an exhibition or at Coasset, I think.
Yes.
Italian Australians creating culture, defining diaspora, moving beyond the migrant narrative in the community museum. Were you both involved in that?
Absolutely.
Now, a couple of things I want to say. How do you create culture?
This is the question that we had, wasn't it? We were really wondering what it was about it being Italian Australian that was different and unique to either being just Australian or just Italian, and that's what we wanted to know. But culture is created every day. It's an ongoing pursuit. We select what we want to keep, and we let go what's no longer relevant to us, and we continue to find both new ways to revere the past and to remember the past, but also bring new things. And society challenges us to bring new elements into culture every day. So that's what we were looking at. We were really asking the question, as we was talking about just a moment ago, with the dispersion of our population, with the growth, with the multi-ethnicity, with the multiple generations, with the different cohorts coming in, different even imaginations, different images of what Italy even means, depending on region, whether or not there was anything behind this idea of having an Italian community.
And when you say moving beyond the migrant narrative, you're referring there to the need to focus on the current generation rather than the early migrants, who most of them.
Not necessarily moving on in focus, but finding a way of making that narrative, transforming it into knowledge that the next generation can use for the issues that are important to us. So the standard kind of migration narrative, the suitcase story, as we know, involves very little background information about where people have come from. They come from a country, they arrive in Australia, they have a bit of a tough time, they find work, assimilate, and hurrah, everything's wonderful. That's the kind of the trajectory. And that works for multicultural policy, and we need that. But there's other things that we need to be talking about for our future. Climate change, healthcare, reconciliation, even the idea of moving beyond this idea of economic contribution, that being the only thing that migrants are good for in Australia, or contribution in general. Moving beyond this idea that we must contribute. What did you contribute to us? And it's like, well, and always, I guess it's that asking for permission. So how do we then move that narrative to a point where we can use it, but we no longer have to ask permission to be Australian?
I think it's not just a question of asking for permission. This notion of contribution is a notion of attaching value to a human being.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
The value is traditionally has been coined in terms of economic value. When the reality is that contributions have been made by not just Italians, but all migrants to the broader Australian community in all spheres of life. The school teacher, for example, is making as much a contribution as the poor peasant boy who arrives without a suitcase, let alone one suitcase, and becomes a multi-millionaire.
Exactly.
Just a different type of contribution. And that's part of the thing, I think, part of the stereotype that I think needs to be addressed and hopefully needs to be redefined. And that's where I see the disconnect, quite frankly, between the condition of your generation and even mine. right? Because your needs are not the needs that we had when we were your age. And conversely, whilst by analogy, something of what we did and or the things that we went through might be helpful, not all of them will be. And really, what needs to happen is a synthesis of what is important, because you really are joining culture and identity. You say, what does it mean to be an Italian?
Exactly.
Quite honestly, I don't know.
Well, that is exactly the conclusion.
Right?
And the 50 family groups we interviewed. So there was 50 family groups, and I can't remember how many people that we
it was
interviewed.
Nearly 200 people.
And that was essentially the conclusion we all drew. What is it to be an Italian Australian, today or even then? Well, it ultimately it's a profoundly Australian story. It's not, it belongs, the story belongs to all Australians, whether or not the broader society chooses to hear it or listen to it or value it. And, we weren't, and nor were we saying too, like these were multiple we interviewed people that were third generation, fourth generation, but also first generation people who come out, post-war, and also people that had come out, like there was a woman whose grandmother had come out and she was 80 and her grandmother had come out, prior to White Australia policy being implemented. So, and everyone said the same thing. We asked the same, the one question we asked everyone was, do you feel Australian? And ultimately, I don't think there was one person, regardless of how Italian they were, who said yes to that question. And then the follow-up question was, well, when do you think we'll start as a diaspora to feel a part, like just a natural part of Australian society? And everyone, regardless of the cohort or generation, said, hopefully the next generation, hopefully. And it gets to a point where you're like, well, how many generations does it take?
Well,
because like I said, my kids are fourth generation and they're still not normal. So
well, and that's what's interesting for a number of reasons, because part of it, I think, reflects the very concept of acceptance, assimilation, and multiculturalism, which we value. But in reality, I think in the Australian context, you've got a dominant culture, which then defines every other culture as subordinate to it, but nevertheless says it's okay. But what we should be really working towards is a situation where one can feel Australian without having to explain from where one comes or what one's heritage is. I mean, what I find often quite annoying is that no one asks, for example, an Irish person, where are you from? And then when they say Ireland, react in a surprised manner. Right? And say to them, well, you speak really good English. So it's that attitude, I think, which is, I think, implicit in multiculturalism. And you'd be aware that in Europe and even in the United States, multiculturalism as a concept has come under attack at the moment because they argue that, it detracts from a national identity, whatever that means. But here in Australia, I think initially it was a positive in the sense that at least recognised the existence of other cultures. Absolutely. But we need not to recognise other cultures merely because they're different, but because they're equal. Absolutely. And that we can all learn from other cultures. And in fact, when one reads history, this concept of cultures in little boxes just doesn't exist. There's always been an interaction and development between cultures.
Absolutely, Vince. And I think that's something that, our families demonstrate that. We don't live in little boxes. We have, in our so-called Italian families, we have Greek, Lebanese, Turkish, Aboriginal, Irish, Anglo, German.
We come just in our family and our family.
We come together as to do Italian things. We still do sauce. We still, you know, do the pig and the sausages and the olives. We do all of that stuff. We remember the stories and review the stories and the knowledges that our grandparents told us. And we are, I guess, Italian because that's where our grandparents came from, but not necessarily attached to a contemporary Italy.
And I think also, from what I've read, that identity is in many ways a function of socialisation. You're probably aware of the group of Bola Bala, who identifies as an Indigenous woman, although her father was of Calabrese origin. And she says that she identifies as an Indigenous woman because of the violence. Now, I assume that she's talking about the violence that her mother probably experienced at the hands of her father. But what I found interesting is that she's chosen to identify with one aspect, one part of the heritage and not the other, which indicates to me that there's certainly a degree of malleability about the concept of identity.
I suppose, like, you know, I have my youngest two children and their father is he's an Aboriginal man. So my children, you know, they are Italian Australian. They're also Aboriginal, and we get asked this question a lot. Do they identify as being Aboriginal, or do they? And the reality is that they will identify as being themselves, and they will identify as being from the Lolicato Thorpe-Kumalatos family, and that is both Indigenous and Italian. You know, they, you know, I can kind of understand this. You know, I want my children to be recognised as Aboriginal because there was such, there was such an effort to annihilate our Indigenous people, and for them to be alive, for them to be here, and for their father and for their grandparents is a protest against that, you know, those policies and those actions. The fact that they are merely alive is the way, and that I can say that these are two little Aboriginal babies is our way of saying, Australia, you will not get away with those past injustices. That said, they are growing up with an Italian Australian mother. They will culturally still be Calabrese, Abruzzese, and Siciliano. You can't escape that because that's who I am, and that's how they'll be brought up, just as our other children are. You know, so it's possible, I suppose, for them to identify with it as being Aboriginal, but then culturally, their experience will be that of Italian Australians as well as Aboriginal Australians. You know, they're both and neither at the same time, I suppose, is how it'll work.
I think that's the truth of it. Why should they have to choose? Unless
they don't.
There's some, you know, traumatic experience in life, which, as obviously, you know, Paula Butler's mother had. In the same way, you would not have experiences, but in Italy there was the same distinction between the north and the south.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So if you're a northerner, you'd look down on your nose at people in the south, and anyone, you know, that married would not want to be identified as a southerner, especially if they were living in the north.
Absolutely.
So that's gone. But even in what used to be considered to be a very homogenous society like Italy, they're now having the similar problems because of the increase in migration. And, you know, we think it's strange that people would migrate to Italy when so many Italians have emigrated away from it. But apparently about 8.85% of the population in Italy now is of African Italian origin. So that's not an insignificant.
Absolutely not. And I think that's where our experience coming from Italy and into a dominant culture from the diaspora can really help inform Italy. You know, often we think of ourselves as being having only things to learn from Italy. You know, as Italian Australians, we can only learn about culture, we can only learn about language looking back at Italy. But actually what we've learned through generations of settlement in Australia I think can be very valuable for Italians and Italian policy into the future.
Yeah.
And it would be fantastic if we had some dialogue about not only the positives of multiculturalism, but some of perhaps the things that we would have liked to have changed or that could have been different, but also we're a window into the future.
Yeah.
We're 3 generations,
At
least
least.
beyond where many groups in Australia are, and where many people in Italy are.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's also interesting, you're probably familiar with the work of Professor Margherita Angelucci.
Ah, yes. Margherita is a friend of the Lolicato twins.
Well, there you go. Who's looking at, identity through the prism of hip-hop, which for someone my age is a bit strange. But what I found interesting in her research is that these African Italians, 2 things. One, their use of language other than Italian in their songs, which indicates that although they identify as Italian, the language itself is not necessarily an identifier of their identity. But more significantly, because I think it does reflect a deeper issue, is that when they do identify, they identify with the region rather than with the national. So, for example, they refer to sono brasiliano, not so italiano, which in a way reflects the traditional identification in Italy.
It does.
200, 300, 400 years ago. And one, the question that arises, why do they do that? And my initial response is, well, that's their world, that's their socialization, that's where they've they've grown up, and that's where the place where all of the influences that have molded them have actually existed. And I find that particularly relevant because I think it applies not just to Italy but to here as well. So I think that's interesting. And language, I think, people used to say that without language you couldn't have culture, you couldn't have identity, which I think is not true. And if you look at your own group, there's about 256,000 third generation Italo-Australians. Only less than 18% speak Italian.
Correct.
45% have mixed ethnicities within them.
Yeah.
So, if language was crucial to your identity, you wouldn't have it in the sense that
absolutely. And this is I'm glad you raised this. This is one of my principal points that I make in my thesis, in my PhD, is that language in Australia in particular is something that is, again, very much governed by policy. We like to express outward multiculturalism, but in fact, English has very much been pushed from the get-go, and our grandparents, remember, came before multiculturalism. So they were in the assimilation period where it was vital that they learnt the language and dropped their mostly dialects. And then when we went to school, we had the standardized Italian, and I don't know if your experience is similar to mine, but we had big red crosses thrown across our dialect language that we tried to bring into Italian class. So there was also, and that was an Italian cultural policy strategy. The strategy of homogenization came to Australia. And I think the fact that we still use words like mapina and paletta, little words here and there to form, like, queso for us, for cheese instead of is a little minor miracle, and again, a little protest. It might not be that we might have forgotten the fluency, but every time we do throw in a word or a phrase, we are indicating, I think, that we're remembering, and we're indicating our differences.
And Italian isn't our language. We didn't grow up with Italian. We grew up with those dialects, which are very different
for us
standard,
anyway.
for standard Italian. Our dialects,
different.
you know, Abruzzese,
But
Calabrese and Siciliano, very, and you know, so even, you know, you look at Calabrese or Siciliano in particular, the dialect isn't just specific to the region; it's specific to the village. You know, like
well, that's true. But in fact, we speak of dialect, but in fact, they were a written language.
they were exactly of their own, on their
in the
own
same
language.
way, the Tuscan was a written language.
Absolutely.
And it's only because Dante chose to write in his native dialect rather than Latin.
But now, we're getting so political, Vince. I love it. But yeah, that's exactly right. Even and UNESCO has raised this, I think, with Italy quite often, in their use of the word dialect to describe what are actually languages in their own right. It has been a point of contention, and again, why some northern languages get to be languages and some southern languages have to stay dialects is hugely political, and
will not stay dialects, be eradicated as dialects.
Well, yeah, is a point of Italian politics and their contention. I think
what I find, as you'd be aware, the United States also had a policy of assimilation, and indeed the Italians that went to the United States assimilated very well. But what I find interesting is that within the third and fourth generation, there was an upsurge of that generation wanting to reconnect with their parents' roots or their grandparents' roots. And so they started going to Italy to try and learn the language and to see relatives that they hadn't seen in years. And I wonder whether Australia, because it's a few years behind the US, will go through a similar phase here when maybe not you, but the next generation will suddenly see the value of trying to reconnect with whatever values or culture or identity that they may find in Italy.
Absolutely. But I think, Vince, what my PhD has really taught me is that when we say Italy, we use it as an identification really to symbolize where our families come from. So we've almost taken, I think, so you interviewed Lucy Calipari a few weeks ago, and her cousin Eleanor as well often referred to the idea of threads, to link where we are and where we've come from. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor to describe actually what we mean when we mean connecting to Italy. I think it's essentially an individual pursuit for belonging and for understanding roots, and for finding our place in the universe and on the planet. And I think that's from the people that I've interviewed through my research that we've interviewed together for that exhibition at COASIT, that seems to be what we mean by reconnecting. So I might not necessarily, some people do, obviously we can't speak on behalf of everybody, but for me, I love Italy as an interesting country. As an archaeologist, I find its history nothing short of fascinating and beautiful. Its art is beautiful. But when I talk about Italy as in me being Italian, it is about Varpodio. It's about it's about where my grandparents have tread.
And personally, I think for me, I want my children being fourth generation Italian Australians and Calabrese Australians in part. The Italian that they would go to and connect with, hypothetically speaking, is not our heritage. That's not us. So what I hope they connect with are the actual stories of their ancestors, the actual reasons forget about this tripe about a better life and the suitcase narrative and migrants did this and migrants. I hope that what they can do to reconnect is to work past those narratives and understand exactly what it was they were leaving, exactly why it was they came here, and that's how they will connect to their history. I want them to know what the landscape was like in Varpodio at the time my grandmother had to leave as a child. I don't necessarily think it's valuable to them to go back to Italy and do a tour of, you know, the Sistine Chapel and faff about.
I mean, it's always valuable to have a look at Rome.
But I don't think culturally, I don't
Yeah.
think as far as understanding themselves and our family and how our family operates, I don't think, you know, going to the Isle of Capri is necessarily beneficial to them, but knowing their stories, knowing their family's history, their struggles, their, you know, how they lived in caves during the war, how they fought against, you know, how they formed and fought against fascists and formed militia groups, and how that's the stuff they need to know.
But what's interesting, and you would have found this, you know, in your work with the current crop of Italian migrants, because what I find fascinating is that, you know, we look at post-World War II, 1950, and the massive influx of migrants into Australia, and we say, oh, very good reasons why they would want to leave, economic reasons, leaving aside. But then you look at Italy, 2020, 2019, and the drove of people that are still leaving, and ostensibly for economic reasons. Who are they? Right? One wonders what is the true motivation. So what is it that, on the one hand, native Italians want to leave, and on the other hand, Italy is now becoming an attraction to other countries' peoples wanting to migrate and live in Italy? That to me is a fascinating issue. But
well, who knows?
So this is the classic push-pull, isn't it? Across Italy's always been so. Our great grandparents, even before they came to Australia, our great grandparents were moving. You know, they were living in France, they were traveling north, they were going to America and coming back. And so I think Italy's always been very, from my understanding, has been unstable for anybody kind of in that agricultural class, in that class of, you know, less than kind of upper middle class and feudal, you know, feudal to some extent too in many of those villages. So it's our imaginations, I think. Vince, it's what we imagine to be on the other side, and in a globalized world, we have that ability to leave and come back and to see if what we imagine to be better or interesting or that we can take from exists, you know. From the Italians that we met through the Mano nella Mano project, who were from the South in particular, and from Calabria in particular, they were telling us about huge youth unemployment. You know,
that's reflected in statistics. Upwards of 45% in 2018.
Well, I think 35%.
35.
Sicily was but in Calabria it is, and it is just incredible to think of that. You know, we panic when it's 8% unemployment in Australia, and that's across all age groups. And to think that, you know, that there really is a lack of opportunity, and maybe because we to some extent see people as being similar to us, we assume that the opportunities are available to them as well.
We're also hearing though of the devaluing of education qualifications in Italy. So, you know, where, you know, in 20 years ago, you know, people were lucky to have a university degree, but now in Italy, people were telling us that, no, you need to have a PhD to do anything, you know, and they just, you know, you can't get work, so you go back to study. But the reaction to that is, the response to that is that everyone has a master's and everyone has a PhD. And there was still that, you know, people from the South were trying to migrate up north, but then they were faced with the exact same kind of prejudice and bias that you were talking about earlier on. And we would hear people who were from the north saying people from the South were coming up and taking all our jobs, which is a similar kind of line that you hear people talk about from the South of those African and other migrants who come in, you know, this idea that people are migrating, whoever it is and from wherever it is, they're migrating and taking our jobs. And that was something that kind of came up over and over again. People felt almost pushed out regardless of how qualified they were or how much experience they had.
Yeah, the fear of loss by the locals, if I can put it that way, is a universal theme. I mean, it was prevalent in Australia. It's now prevalent in Italy. But I think one of the other, if one wants to speak of structural issues, it seems to me that one of the structural issues within Italy is that there isn't the same prospect for younger people in Italy for a number of reasons. And one story that this is in Milan about 4 years ago, and this fellow, he was an architect, and he would have been about 32, and he was working in the top architectural firm in Milan, earning a pittance, right? Saying I can't leave home because I can't afford to pay or buy accommodation, and his prospects were limited because all the older people who were the partners, they weren't going to go. And so he's doing what he said was important work. He applied for a job in Shanghai and he was offered the job, and at, I think, double the pay, transportation costs picked up by the employer, free housing, right? And so he goes to his boss and he says, look, I don't want to leave Italy, but, I've got this job, and unless, you don't expect you to match it, but at least you've got to give me a rise. And the boss said, look, we can't afford to give you a rise. Why would you want to go to China, right? You'd be a fool. So anyway, he's off in China. Right.
That's the thing, isn't it? Like people, and I think Italians, that has almost become a cultural aspect in itself, is this idea of following opportunity and moving where one needs to in order to find that financial security.
But what it really means also is that there's a real brain drain from Italy, and that's what I think is a large part of the problem that confronts Italy at the moment, that all its better people are leaving because they can do better elsewhere and they're not appreciated in their own country. And you speak to people at universities and they'll tell you, we train people here, they do these studies, and the first chance they get to go and do a PhD in the United States or England or anywhere else, off they go. Ostensibly, as soon as they finish their PhD, they're going to come back, but they never do.
No.
And that's just talent that's lost and being used in another place for the benefit of that place and not of Italy. So that, I think,
absolutely. And that's the difference between, I guess, our grandparents and your parents' generation and what's happening today is that, our grandparents were pretty much pushed out of Italy by these dual policies that where Italy had to relieve itself of some of its poverty-stricken population, and Australia needed arms and legs and brawn, to survive and to thrive into the 21st century. So this is the thing. With diaspora comes the culture creation that happens from very much linked to the society, policy, governments, and technology. And what a person is allowed to do at the time that they're around will dictate where the culture goes.
Absolutely.
And in the case of Italy, you've also got the added stress of geography and size and earthquakes and that kind of thing. You've got people still living in tents outside of L'Aquila. For example. Things just.
True.
There's compounding factors there that mean that there's not stable employment, I suppose, for that generation.
I want to ask about the Ascolta women, because I understand you're part of that group.
Yes.
Well,
I call them my coven. I love them.
Well, tell us what is the Ascolta women group?
So Ascolta is a multidisciplinary, multi-generation, multi-cohort gaggle, group, gang, posse of Italian Australian women, mostly from Victoria, Adelaide, and I think New South Wales as well, where we're gaining tentacles and moving around. They've just published a fantastic anthology. Unfortunately, I couldn't be a part of it, but it's there. Stories from the Inside, which documents the experience of being an Italian Australian, I guess, observer and participant in COVID-19. So in 2020 Australia, but really it is a support network. It is a group of thinkers, and I think what we're ultimately doing is developing an Italian Australian feminism, or an Italian Australian way of advocating and bringing that perspective, that history into the contemporary. So it's magic.
Yeah. Well, it is, and I was going to ask you because, in fact, as I understand it, it originated from a forum, which was a women-only event,
Yes.
which was looking at ascolta, listening to unheard stories, Italian Australian multi-generation women's experiences and migration legacies.
Yes.
So it was obviously a deliberate choice to limit it to women.
Yes, I think that was Teresa who organised it. Her one of the stipulations that she wanted to make. I presented at that forum, which was a huge honour and an incredibly personally quite an emancipative experience. But the idea, I think, behind, and I might be wrong, this is just from my understanding of it being a women's only forum, was that that first meeting was really about letting it all out. And the reality is that a lot of women were carrying around the legacy of personal home lives, the legacy of difficult settlement experiences, and also I think sometimes it's important to come together. I think for everything that's happening politically at the moment in terms of gender association, sometimes this experience of being a gendered person within a cultural group is important enough to protect once every blue moon. Yeah. So, and I think that was what it was, because there were in that forum difficult experiences being shared. We weren't in any way, we weren't building burning effigies and chanting, putting curses. There's no malopia happening. It was very much about giving, I think, particularly in the second generation, that group an opportunity to speak freely.
I've read the book and I've read the introduction or the welcome at the forum, and it reads very angry to me, I've got to say. It says, the welcome says, "This is a specific welcome to you. I want to speak directly to you. I hope you hear in this forum what you have wanted to hear for a long time but couldn't, or wanted to say or write or scream but couldn't. I hope others can hear you in this forum. It may be the beating of your heart, the tightening of your stomach, the quickening breath, the clasping and unclasping of your hands, your eyes opening wide, your tears falling, your laughter. We hear you, even if you don't speak or write. Know that we have heard you. Know that we have shared with you those things that have been kept inside, that have been covered with dark blankets of intellect, rationalisation, forgetfulness, obscurity, confusion, the fear, the vergogna, the shame, those secrets, those private memories." Now, that to me sounds as if there's a lot of pent-up, well, I called it anger, but perhaps it's just frustration. Is it the fact that women feel and generationally that they haven't had the opportunity to be heard, or
I think the short answer is yes, Vincent. The short answer is yes, absolutely. And again, that doesn't come from just within the community, where we do have these, bella figura, or these kind of cultural ideas about presentation of self and keeping it together. But, you know, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen somebody like Lolicato, for instance, on question, you know, Q&A or the drum. You know, I don't see, there was never, I think Italian Australians and Italian Australian women as well, and probably in particular, missed that boat when it came to inclusion and representation. So, you know, that generation in particular, and the generation before them, doesn't get a public forum.
I think 2 points. Quite frankly, you two are the living contradiction, really, to the not being heard and not wanting to say. But I understand that in the past, there wasn't, in fact, an attempt by any group to self-represent, and I think that's one of the issues within the Italian community.
Absolutely, I think
the Calabrian community. We've left it to others to represent who we are.
Absolutely,
and that's resulted in public stereotypes which have got nothing to do with the truth or the reality, but have been accepted as such.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think we do have to remember, Vincent, we were here, COASIT, for instance, the organisation, but Italian Australian groups in particular really had a huge role to play in the creation of multicultural policy. And at the time, the idea that you could just achieve kind of that baseline equality, working with getting fair wages, for instance, that they had other things to fight for. Representation and self-actualization didn't seem like a priority, you know. So we had to some extent, accept that idea of being tolerated, of being represented by, you know,
you define. I mean, you said that you described us as the contradiction to that, but I suppose where we got lucky, you know,
this is our privilege.
Yeah,
really. This is where the continuation of what can happen.
It should be the status quo. You should have the right to speak and be heard. That's the point. But the point people, for example, don't realise, but in terms of language and teaching Italian and other languages in schools, one of the people that devised the policy, Professor Joseph LaBianco, is Calabrese. Nobody would know that, right? And part of the issue, as I say, is that whether it's modesty or whatever reason, we don't generally beat our own drum, right?
No.
We get the job done, and once it's done, we move on.
Absolutely.
But with women, I think it's true that culturally they were at a disadvantage, because the reality was that the woman was seen to be primarily concerned with the home, and the males were concerned with external matters.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of the women worked outside the home.
Even though they worked outside, and even though they actually ran the whole show. But that's by the by. And secondly, I think although there were individual examples of women writers who were writing in the 60s and the 70s about their situation. But so I think it's a good thing that women want to be heard and be seen to be heard. But I just wondered whether it was just focused entirely on the female experience, and which I think is not the whole story. That's all.
Oh no, of course, and it can never, any representation can never be the whole story, you know. So we can't ever, whether it be in an exhibition or in a book or publication or in a group, ever expect to have everything explained at once, which is why we need to keep telling them in various different groups and configurations, you know, and part of that, I think, is the language that we use in general too. So you were just talking about how perhaps we don't see ourselves as contributing in other ways, in various ways. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with how we frame ourselves. We don't we don't frame people who work for the rights of our community or who helped bring people here. We don't use the words activist. We don't use we don't use these powerful words. We use those more convivial markers, those words to really make sure that our history isn't threatening in any way, and I think what newer generations of migrants have done, and most definitely campaigns run by Indigenous Australia has done, is I think opened up the terrain, and we can now use some more powerful language around some people like Lena Santaspirito, for instance, has always been framed historically within the community as a kind of Mother Teresa kind of, benevolent kind of character, when really she was an organizer, she was an advocate, she was a protester, and I think when we start to see ourselves differently, we will start to learn different lessons from our history. So maybe, Vince, then you can be in charge of starting the Escolta group for boys. There are certainly issues too that boys from Italian and other core backgrounds face that definitely need to be addressed. There are lower rates of university admission or even high school completion for Calabrese Australian boys. Absolutely. Then Calabrese Australian girls. There's this idea too that boys are good with their hands. Our boys are good with their hands. They'll be good mechanics. Yeah, they're not. There's no intellectualization. And there's nothing of we've got many tradies in our family, our parents and our brothers included, but our sons can also go to university. They need to be seen and valued within the education system as being capable of that too, to be steered in those directions. There's stereotypes about them being aggressive. There's plenty of scope there for for people to start advocating for our boys. And as a mother of 5 sons, I definitely do my best to do that.
You'll join the group. That's good. Now, personally, what do you have any other projects other than completing your PhD? And
how much do you want us to do? No, so at the moment we're continuing to build the Foundling Archive, the archive of oral histories. For instance, we're working with the City of Whittlesea, and we're creating a document that builds on from the Italian foundations of lay law in particular, and the Calabrese foundations of lay law, and we're seeing how it is now to live in what's happened in that community. We're hoping to extend and expand the Italian Australian project, so to hopefully push into some regional areas, which would be fantastic. We've started a podcast, Archive Australia. We're presenting at some conferences later on in the year about our work, in particular a short film that we made about our dad growing up in Swan Hill. So there's stuff to be done. Good. And the COVID stuff isn't over, Vincent. So people. That new cohort of Italians, I think we really do need to open up the lines of communication between these newbies, these new Italian Australians and Calabrese Australians and us. I do think that there needs for us to be a community into the future. We actually need to encounter each other every now and then. And not as competition. No, and not this old, that's not the way it is now. Kind of this kind of, no, I wouldn't say animosity, but this tension between the tension between the nostalgic and the contemporary.
Well, hopefully we our association is planning to have an Australian Calabrese conference in Australia late this year, and hopefully
we got stuff we can come on
to present, which would be very, very worthwhile, and we'll keep you informed about that. But look, we've gone a bit over time, but thank you so much. It's been
that's okay. We chit chat, and there's two of us, Vincent. So that's expected.
enjoyable conversation, and I hope you've enjoyed it half as much as I have. Thanks very much.
Oh,
absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us. Thank you. We appreciate it.
And for teaching us some things along the way.
Absolutely.